You fool! Warren is dead. Werewolves of Weird Tales. Lupa by Robert Barber Johnson. God, said the man in the white coat huskily. The hot little room was very still. Almost you might have thought that only its shadows were alive. They moved incessantly, those stark black shadows in the candlelight. They danced and leaped and gibbered. They were never quiet. But the men who threw those shadows, the man in the white coat bending over the bed, the small man with the cigar beside him, the big man with the twinkling brass buttons at the broken door, all these might well have been dead images in some grotesque waxworks group, so white their faces, so still they were. The man with the cigar said at last, not moving, It's not normal, huh, Doc? The other nodded, still absorbed. We'll do a complete dissection down at the morgue, he muttered. That's the only way we can say positively. But even without it, I can see. The variances are slight, Inspector, slight, but definite. The length of limbs, the shape of the head, the very hang of the skeleton and texture of the hair. Nothing is quite right. It's the queerest freak. The man with the cigar looked at him. Freak? He echoed softly. Freak, eh? Well, maybe, Doc, maybe. It's a handy word to call it by, although I could think of others. Anyhow, it's dead. We can be thankful for that. He drew the sheet back up over what lay on the bed, mopped at his forehead with a handkerchief. Somewhere, far off in the night, a dog was howling mournfully. Yeah, Doc, said the man with the cigar. It's dead, and that's just swell. How'd you like to have seen it when it was alive, as Cassidy and that young man say they did? There was still life in the eyes when they broke the door down, they tell me. They rolled in their direction with a sort of pleading look, and the lips twisted in, I guess it was just a dying snarl, Doc. But it looked for all the world as if the thing were smiling at 'em. No wonder the young fellow fainted dead away, and that Cassidy got sick at his stomach. Just imagine how they felt, Doc, breaking into a room where they thought a young girl was lying sick and helpless, and finding a thing like that lying on her bed in her place, just as if it was some awful travesty on Red Riding Hood, Doc. Why, it was enough to drive any man out of his mind, much more that poor young devil who was so in love with her. He just sits with his head in his hands and moans, Lupa, oh God, my Lupa, over and over again. I tell you, if I don't locate that girl and bring her back to him. I've thrown out a police dragnet all over town, of course, and I'll have a nationwide broadcast of her description. If she's to be found, Doc, we'll find her for him. That much is sure. But you'll notice I said if. Myself, I've got no faith at all that we'll ever see her again. What, why? Well, Doc, partly because of that thing over there on her bed. What am I talking about? Well, Doc, it's awfully hard to put my meaning into words that a scientist like you can understand. Those queer, monstrous hintings that have come down to us from mankind's very beginnings, they don't mean a thing to you. You aren't superstitious, but I am, Doc. I'm Irish, you see. I believe in ghosts and hoodoos and banshees and, well, in whatever I'm afraid this girl was, Doc. Maybe it's silly to be like that, and then again, maybe it isn't. It's a question we can't settle, Doc, no matter how much we talk. But all I know is that after I leave this place tonight, I'm going to church, Doc. To a church I've not set foot in since I was a little shaver. And I'm going to pray to the good God that protects us all from the powers of darkness. Look, Doc, I'll try to put this thing in some sort of way so that you can get it. I'll take it according to evidence, not just according to what I happen to think or feel. I'll give you facts, Doc. Hard, concrete facts that there's no getting away from. As solid as that stiff, dead thing under the sheet yonder. Oh, I don't just mean the fact of this girl's disappearance, and the fact that something else was found dead in here after she vanished. That isn't conclusive, Doc. And I know it just as well as you. But let me ask you just one question, Doc. How did the girl get out? That door wasn't just locked when they broke it in, you know. It was bolted with a bolt set on the inside. And the window was locked and shuttered, also in a way that couldn't be done from without. So unless there's some trick exit from this room we've not found yet, either there's a secret passage out of this place, or else I'm right and you're wrong, Doc. There's just no other way of figuring it. You and your thousands of years or so of scientific progress are wrong. And we're right back in the Dark Ages amid all the terrors of forgotten superstition. How'd she get out of here, Doc? Not a living soul in the boarding house saw her go. None of 'em doubted for an instant that she was still locked up in here with one of her spells. Oh, yes, she had spells, Doc. Just what sort they were no one seems to know, because she never let anyone see her at such times. She'd just lock herself in her room for days at a time, refusing to let anyone call a doctor or do anything for her. She'd just lie in the dark like some poor sick animal. Half the time she wouldn't even eat anything. Trays the landlady brought up just piled up untasted in the corridor. Oh, they say that once in a while a tray would disappear, but never while anyone was near to see the girl open the door and take it in. Sometimes she wouldn't even answer 'em when they tried to talk to her through the door, to ask her whether she was in pain or needed anything. And when she did reply, her voice, well, they tell me it didn't sound like a human voice at all, Doc. It was strange, hoarse, guttural, as if the poor kid could hardly talk at all, as if she were forcing every word through a throat twisted almost out of human semblance. But all she'd say to them was, "I'm all right," over and over again. "Don't worry, I'm all right." It must have been hell for all the boarders at such times, Doc, but worst of all for this young man I told you about. The suspense of it, the awful mystery. But he always respected her wishes, you see, and never disturbed her. It was only after a week had gone by without a word from her, when he couldn't even hear her breathing or moving on the other side of the door, that he got scared and called in Cassidy off the beat. Oh yes, she's had plenty of time to get away in, Doc, providing she could go out under the crack of the door or through the keyhole like a ghost. There just isn't any other way out of here. And this thing in her place, dead on her bed, I suppose it came in through the crack or the keyhole too, after she was gone. If it were any other girl than this Lupa, you might think she'd been keeping a pet up here secretly, and left it behind when she disappeared. I've heard of people doing things like that. But not this girl, Doc. No, sir. Because, you see, pets and this Lupa just didn't mix. There was some queer quality about her that frightened beasts and birds. Just a pretty, sweet, harmless-looking kid, Doc, and yet the mere sight of her would send almost any animal into paroxysms of terror. There was that time her young man told me about, when the dogs, although their attitude wasn't exactly fearful on that occasion, I'll have to admit. But perhaps their very numbers gave 'em confidence. Perhaps they ganged up against something they hated more than they dreaded. But I'd better tell this yarn the way he tells it, Doc. This Ralph Evans, a decent sort of chap, bookish and bespectacled and sort of frail, but nice. I liked him a lot. He'd been working late at the library that night, he says. the night of the worst blizzard of the year. He left about 11 and ploughed home through the thick snow clouds with his coat collar turned up against the howling wind and his arms full of books, his mind 1,000 miles removed from Lupa's Arcus. As a matter of fact, he says he'd only met the girl a few times up until then. She'd been at his boarding house only a few weeks, and they'd said hello to each other when they met in the corridors or in the dining room and chatted a bit, and that was about all. He wasn't even thinking about her now as he turned into his home street, though the blizzard was so thick he couldn't even read the signposts, and waded up it through the fast-piling drifts and the sifting white curtain that was freezing cold against his face. Then suddenly he halted, as if he'd hit a brick wall. There ahead of him, not 10 feet off, the thing he saw just didn't seem real to him at first, he says. It was more like some sort of queer stage tableau. There was even a handy lamppost to throw a sort of spotlight over the scene, leaving everything beyond in deepest shadow. And in that circle of dazzling light he realized a girl was kneeling. She knelt there in the snowdrifts, arms flung up to cover her face, abject fear expressed in every line of her body. The white flakes sifted gently down over the scarcely lesser whiteness of perfect arms and shoulders, over the delicate curves and moulding of a figure that might well have been the masterpiece of some old Greek sculptor. Stark naked she knelt there in all that bitter cold, naked save for her unbound white gold hair that shimmered over her body like a garment or an animal's white fur. And about her, as she cowered there, a dozen smaller shapes were crouching. It seemed to him that every dog in the neighborhood was gathered there. He knew several of them by sight. An old lady's pet Peak, a wire-haired terrier the children next door played with, the corner grocer's dachshund, a couple of small mongrels, all the most harmless sort of little beasts imaginable. But they weren't harmless to the girl, you could see that. They ringed about her with hackles standing up with rage and little bodies tense, with teeth bared and eyes glowing a yellowish green, and the whole circle of them was slowly closing in. How long he stood there staring like a fool, he has no idea. It must have been a long time. He simply couldn't believe what he saw. The girl, kneeling helpless and stricken there in the freezing snow, the slowly tightening circle of little creatures that hunted her down. Good Lord, those harmless little neighborhood tykes. And yet it might almost have been a scene from some old Russian folk tale, with the wolves about to pull down some forlorn exile on the steppes. He came to life at last, of course. He sprang forward, shouting at the dogs. Just as he did so, a big black mongrel, an evil-looking brute he'd never seen about before, launched himself straight at the girl's throat. Young Evans' rush caught him in mid-leap, bowled him over in the snow. Then the rest of them charged. There was quite a melee for a moment, a boiling up of little shapes about him, the flash of savage, worrying little fangs, and a rush of thudding forms against his body. He struck and kicked and cursed and almost went down beneath the savage, silent rush of them. That was the most terrifying part of it all, he says. The silence. Not one of those little beasts gave tongue talk. Not one of them yelped when hurt or snarled when attacking. They fought silently, grimly as shadows. Then suddenly it was all over. He stood holding an unconscious girl in his arms, amid a circle of trampled, blood-stained snow. The dogs were gone. He hadn't seen them go, hadn't seen the flitting shapes of them fade away in the blizzard. They just weren't there any longer. There were only those fast-disappearing little tracks in the snow to show that the whole thing hadn't been some sort of delusion. Far off, through the storm, he made out the glowing lights of his boarding house, beacons of sanity. He made for them, carrying the girl, her unconscious head on his shoulder. "He says he knew right then that he was in love with her, Doc. Right then. He didn't need all their ripening friendship during the months that followed. He'd fought for this woman like some knight of old, and he felt that she belonged to him, and him alone. And yet he never really learned much about her in all that time. About this pretty, platinum-haired girl with the queer lisping accent that hinted at a foreign origin, for all her American dress and American ways. About her there was always a veil of mystery he couldn't penetrate. Up to a point her life was an open book. She was not in the least reticent or secretive about herself. He'd never known a franker, more open, more winning personality. She was everybody's friend in the boarding house, always ready to do a kindness, always gay and friendly and loyal to a fault. And yet, for all her frankness and friendliness, she contrived it somehow, that no one should ever really know much about Lupa. Queer name, ain't it, Doc? Lupa. A name you wouldn't run across very often. The first word means, well, I know enough Latin for that, Doc. And that last name, what is it? Central European? Magyar? Pole? The young man says she spoke of Transylvania several times. Seemed to know that country very well. Does that mean anything to you, Doc? Well, it does to me. You see, we had a guy on the squad once who came from that part of the world. He used to wear a sprig of wolfbane in his buttonhole all the time, Doc, as a charm to keep off things that were neither quite human nor quite unhuman, Doc, but that ranged the steppes of his native land in either shape at will, and lived off human blood. I wish we had him here now, Doc. He could make this thing clearer to you than I can hope to. Look, Doc, these attacks of hers were genuine, whatever they were. Everyone in this house agrees on that. But why wouldn't she let anyone do anything for her at such times? Or even see her? Why did she hide herself away from everyone for at least 3 days out of each month, Doc? Days corresponding roughly to the full of each moon. Why is it that no one ever saw her when she was ill, until this time when they burst in her door and found, well, not a human being in this room at all? What did it mean? A young girl hiding herself away from everyone like that, at a time when she was supposed to be so ill that she could hardly move, when she couldn't eat anything or drink anything, when she was so stricken that all she could do was lie on her bed and moan and whine and howl. Yes, howl, Doc. Even her young man admits that there were delirious intervals when her weird cries kept everyone in the house awake at night, when the only answer she could make to questions was to croak in that changeling voice, "I'm all right. I'll be all right." And she always would be, too. That was the strangest part of all. After days of lying helpless, hardly able to talk, stricken, days and nights during which the whole household would almost go crazy with worry for her, then suddenly the door would open, and out she'd come, looking not a whit worse for her ordeal. Indeed, she'd look better somehow, the young man said, refreshed, strengthened in some bizarre way he couldn't describe. Her colour would be better, her eyes clearer, her smile gayer and more ready. And she'd laugh at all their questions about that cloistered interval, treat the whole thing as if it had been some sort of monstrous hoax. Well, it used to drive this young man of hers almost crazy, not knowing what was wrong, not being able to help her. He begged her to see a doctor, to try to do something for the trouble, whatever it was. "There's no medicine on this earth for what I've got," she told him once, "and no doctor on earth who could help me. There's no treating a thing that's in the blood, that's been bred into a family strain over long generations. Every man and woman of my line since time immemorial has borne this taint from birth until death. There is no escaping it. My parents fled to America from the old country, hoping that they might leave it behind, escape into a new world and a new life. But the taint followed them, dogged them to their dying day. It cannot be cured. It can't even be explained. A doctor? Ah, my poor friend, I should like to see the face of any doctor to whom I so much as tried to tell what is wrong with me. And even if by some miracle he should believe me, what could he do? There is no drug that can stay, no medicine that can cure a malady like mine, a thing that's seared into the very bones, twisted into the very fibres and sinews and veins of the body, eaten into the very mind by generation upon generation of evil heredity. There is no hope for me in heaven or hell. But I have sworn, she went on, that I shall bear my cross alone, that no one else shall suffer or be harmed through me. The sickness I have is contagious, not perhaps quite in the sense that you use that word, but contagious nevertheless at the time when it's at its height. And so I shut myself away from everyone, lock myself up, lest unknowingly I should hurt those who seek to help me, that I should make them too into beings like myself, outcasts from all hope, either here or hereafter. And that was all the young man ever found out about what ailed her, Doc, throughout all those long months when he was her constant companion, when he was quite certain that love of him was growing in her heart. He tried in every way to find out what disease, what strange, obscure ailment could have symptoms like that. He says he haunted every medical library in town, read everything that he could get his hands on. He even consulted physicians unknown to Lupa. But of course they only pulled long faces and spouted long Latin words that meant only, "Damned if I know, Doc," when you figured them out. And the medical books told him just as little. At last he couldn't bear the suspense any longer, Doc. He cornered the girl one night last week on the porch swing, after the rest of the boarders had retired and they had the veranda to themselves. It has been an unusually hot fall, you know, and the air that night was sultry and still, like the weather just before a storm, you know. A sort of suspense was in the air. The noises of the city were as faint and far off as if they were alone in the heart of a wilderness. A nearly full moon was rising. "Lupa," young Evans told her then, "this thing can't go on. I love you, dear, don't you understand? I love you. I can't let you go on facing the horror of this secret by yourself. Whatever it is, we'll share it, fight it, beat it together. Will you be my wife, darling, and let me help you with all your troubles, always?" He took her into his arms. A little breeze rustled among the few last wisteria blooms left on the porch vines. He says for one moment of heaven he thought he'd won, Doc. She answered his kisses, her body pressed against his, her arms locked tight about him. Her soft lips crushed against his so vehemently that he could feel little sharp teeth through them. And her eyes, well, he'd heard of a woman's eyes shining with love, Doc, but he'd never realized that it was literal before. But her eyes actually did shine in the darkness, he says. They began to glow with a sort of queer greenish inner light. Then suddenly she wrenched herself free of his embrace and sprang up. "Oh, no," she cried, her voice strangely hoarse. "What am I thinking of? What was I about to do? Oh, God, no!" She retreated from him, hands thrown up before her. How horribly that gesture reminded him of that other night long months before. Retreated until he couldn't see her face any more, but only the whiteness of her dress and the whiteness of her strange hair, a blurred outline that might almost have been a wreath of fog, but for the glinting of green eyes in it. "Lupa," he begged. "Lupa, please, dear, come back. Please." She didn't answer, just stood there motionless and utterly still. He could hear the soft whispering of that little breeze in the vines, the far-off howling. Then suddenly her hands went to her throat. She made a little sound, as if she were trying to speak, a strange, guttural sound that somehow terrified him. Then she turned and ran across the veranda and into the house. He caught a glimpse of her, silhouetted against the hallway's light for an instant as she passed, a silhouette with vaguely disturbing outlines. Then she was gone. There was a pattering of footsteps along the upper hall and the distant closing of a door. "Whatever was the matter with the Lupa Zarcus?" his landlady asked a moment later. "She just passed me on the stairs, running like mad, and didn't speak or look up. She was all crouched down, and her hair was hanging over her face." It was very still in the hot little room. Almost, you might have thought, as the voice of the man with the cigar died away in the silence, that only its leaping shadows had life. "And you think," the man in the white jacket said at last, softly. The man with the cigar nodded. "Yeah," he said with equal softness. "Yeah, Doc. That's exactly what I think. That's why I sent for you, Doc, after I'd heard this young fellow's story, just as I told it to you just now. I sent for a doctor because I wanted to know whether whatever it was that he found when he broke into his sweetheart's room was normal or abnormal. Not that it really makes a bit of difference, Doc, because it's the thing's very presence here that strains all coincidence. For listen to one last bit of proof, Doc. Listen to this description of Lupa Zarcus that her young man gave me. It's accurate, I think. He wants me to look for someone tall and slim and aristocratic-looking, graceful and quick in her movements, beautiful and intelligent, with great melting black eyes and almost snow-white platinum hair and skin. And that isn't at all hard to do, Doc, because, you see, what answers that description to the last detail is lying right here on this very bed." He flung the sheet back. In the candlelight, the sprawled form there was very hard to see, but you could make it out. "A wolfhound, Doc," the man with the cigar muttered. "A great snow-white wolfhound." The Horror Undying by Manly Wade Wellman. The sheaf of papers, I had found it under the ancient flooring that I pulled up to make a fire, intrigued me at once. The cabin offered shelter, the blaze warmth, and now I had found entertainment. I could forget the night outside, and the blizzard and this chill forest in which I had lost myself. I could forget, too, the disquieting man with the beard and the shabby clothes who had stopped me at the edge of the trees before I began my walk, mumbling something about haunted places. A foreigner, evidently, who smelled abominably of garlic. Sitting on a broken stool before the fireplace, I spread the ragged, faded sheets upon my knee. The largest item was a paper-backed book or pamphlet of the size of an old-fashioned dime novel. In my fancy I can see, now as then, the limp, discoloured cover, tinted red by the flickering firelight, and the lengthy title in uneven, ornate capitals. A true story of the revolting and bloody crimes of Sergeant I. Stanless, USA, his court-martial and execution. Below this promising indication of excitement within, there was a bloody executed woodcut of a full-length human figure. I held it close to the flames for a clearer view. The dress, I saw at once, was the American cavalry uniform of the middle 19th century. Shiny boots with spurs, stripe-sided pantaloons, a brief dragoon jacket, and a round, visored cap. 3 chevrons upon the sleeve stamped the man as a sergeant, and even as I noted this, my eye caught more and smaller words beneath the picture. Sergeant Stanless, from a drawing by the author, and under this the information, privately printed 1848. Price 10 cents. 10 cents? Was it a dime novel after all? A dime novel of especially thrilling content? Remembering such shockers as The Feast of Blood, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, The Secret of the Great Turret, and others, I studied the cover illustration again. The author-artist had depicted his subject in a pose at once formalized and dashing. The booted, spurred feet were planted jauntily apart, toes pointing outward at what must have been an uncomfortable angle. The right hand was thrust into the front of the dragoon jacket, Napoleon fashion, while the left rested elegantly upon a sabre hilt. It was all a trifle ludicrous and waxworky. I might have laughed at it, except for the face. It was a round face, framed in heavy side whiskers. The eyes beneath the cap visor were large and expressionless, and so placed as to seem to stare out at anyone who looked at the picture. Below and between them jutted a long, straight nose, thin and sharp as a chisel. The mouth was half open and lipless, and showed two tiny, pointed upper teeth. The chin, well, there was no chin, or very little. Despite the crudity and stiffness of the old woodcut as a whole, that countenance had something of dread, authentic life. I paused to throw more floorboards on the fire, then opened the pamphlet and began to read. The opening of the narrative was flat, in keeping with the style of the 1840s. It said, rather casually, that one Ivan Stanlis was born in Prussia, near the Polish border, about the year 1810, and that he came to America as a boy of 12. In 1827, 5 years after his arrival, he enlisted in the United States Army. His record, it appeared, was good, even brilliant. The anonymous biographer suggested that had Stanlis been of American birth, he might have won an officer's commission. Foreigner though he was, he rose rapidly to the rank of sergeant first class, and as such did several tours of duty at forts in the South and West. At the outbreak of the Mexican War, he saw active service with a dragoon regiment and was wounded at Monterey. In 1847, he was senior non-commissioned officer of a squadron ordered to build and garrison a fort in the western part of the newly acquired territory of Texas. Up to this point, the narrator had seemed vague, as if information on Sergeant Stanlis's early career was his only by hearsay. But the incident of the fort building and all that followed was by contrast extraordinarily clear and vivid. I, reading by the firelight, guessed that the unknown pamphlet here must have made Stanlis's actual acquaintance at that time. Perhaps the forming of the squadron brought together the units in which the two men had been serving. The fort came in for full, eloquent description. A rectangular stockade of upright logs with sharp tips, rough barracks and stables in orderly array inside, neat ricks of hay cut on the prairies, troops drilling or working under the eyes of their officers, sentries on post, and over all the brilliant stir of the stars and stripes. The war was over now. The garrison felt relieved and relaxed, even peaceful. But a terror was to come that would dwarf the grimmest adventure of the oldest and most seasoned veteran. Nothing for a time but boresome routine. Then, twice in succession, the account stated, sentries were found dead in the dawn, or rather, what was left of sentries. The bodies were mangled, mutilated, bloody, the fleshiest parts cut clean away and missing. Indian raiders was the instant pronouncement of the commanding officer, and after the second atrocity a scouting party was sent out to find and punish the enemy. Stanlis himself rode with that party, and it was he who found, or appeared to find, a trail. Following him, the avengers rode for 4 hours across the prairie, and came at last upon an encampment of Comanche hunters. Taken by surprise, a full half of the Indians fell before the first deadly volley of the troops. The others fled on their swiftest ponies without offering battle. Several wounded Indians were captured and questioned, but all denied attacking or even visiting the fort. They feared, it seemed, a devil that sneaked and hunted around their campfires at night and devoured women, children, and even full-grown warriors, a devil that lurked and laired among the white men. The soldiers naturally scorned this story as fantastic, and brought back the prisoners, 5 of them. As they approached the fort, it was recorded, the Indians trembled fearfully. That night, they were placed in the hospital building, and on the following morning one was missing. He was reported escaped despite severe wounds and close guard, and double vigilance was instituted. A day and a night passed, a new sun rose, and a second Indian had vanished. Stanless happened to be sergeant of the guard on this particular morning, and the commander of the garrison, investigating in the hospital, called upon him for a report. As Stanless entered, the 3 remaining Indians set up a wild and unwarriorly wail of terror. All jabbering at once, they expressed sudden dread of the sergeant. He, they charged, had killed and carried away their 2 comrades. He was the devil of the fort, which they now knew would be their ultimate destroyer. Stanless listened in scornful silence for a moment or two, then broke in upon their frantic charges with angry denials. When they refused to retract, he whipped out his saber and slashed the nearest Indian across the face. Disarmed by 2 troopers, he was placed under arrest by the commander. A routine search of his quarters was ordered. As senior sergeant of the garrison, Stanless had a 1-room cabin to himself, and the flooring in it proved loose. Reading at this point, I glanced down nervously at the vacant space I had torn in the floor of my own shelter. The boards lifted, searchers saw loose earth. A few probing digs with a spade discovered the skeletons of the 2 missing Indians, stripped almost entirely of flesh. From this point forward, the narrative grew tense and fascinatingly dire, as if the author was bringing a morbid warmth to his work. Sergeant Stanless, confronted with the grisly findings, confessed to cannibalism. He had murdered and eaten not only these and other Indians, but the 2 butchered sentries and many other white men and women in the East. How many, he did not know. All he could say was more than 50, perhaps 100. Explanation he could not or would not give, except that he was tormented with an overpowering hunger for human flesh. He relished most the heart and the liver. Facing the court-martial, he pleaded guilty and made a singular request. That speech of Sergeant Stanless sticks closest in my memory, for I returned later and read it again. Burn me to ashes, I greatly wish it. Only thus can my soul be redeemed. The officers of the court-martial, they must have been a shocked and pallid gathering, passed sentence, but decreed a less painful death than the one for which the confessed man-eater had begged. He was placed before a firing squad, to make which, the pamphlet said, every one of his former comrades volunteered. After Stanless had fallen before their shots, the sergeant in charge of the detail walked close to examine him. The bloody form was seen to move, the eyes slowly opened. Drawing a pistol, the sergeant fired a bullet point-blank through Stanless's brain, and a few minutes later a medical officer pronounced the guilty one dead. The riddled corpse was buried outside the fort at a considerable distance from the regular cemetery, and was left unmarked. That was the end of the account, at least of the printed part. But at the foot of the final page was a rusty-looking smudge. I drew a brand from the fire to shed brighter and more direct light. With difficulty, I made out a single word, written crabbedly and in ink so ancient and faded as to be almost invisible. Fools. I closed the pamphlet and gazed once more at the portrait of Ivan Stanless upon the cover. As before, the expressionless eyes seemed to stare fixedly at me. Even so, I mused, must the real man's eyes have looked while his fellow sergeant gave him the coup de grace. And the loose mouth seemed to smile at me in mockery. I felt suddenly nauseated with the blood-bolted tale. Whether it was true or not, I refused to guess. My chief desire was to forget it as quickly as possible, to find more pleasant reading matter for a lonely night in a strange, isolated cabin. Dropping the pamphlet to the floor, I turned my attention to the other papers in my lap. There remained a couple of loose sheets or scraps, fastened together with a corroded pin. Removing this, I studied the topmost fragment. It was a roughly torn upper quarter of an inside page from an old newspaper. At the top margin, I could make out a part of the heading. ITA, Eagle, July 11, 1879. The torn piece was 3 columns wide and filled with short news items, mostly paragraphs with datelines, grist of the journal's telegraph mill. To such inner pages might a reader turn leisurely after he had satisfied a more pressing news hunger with long accounts on the front page of War in Europe or Scandal at Home. Around one of the small items, centrally located on the middle column of the sheet, was drawn a bold circle in dark ink, as if to direct attention to it. The headline, also included within the circle, was in small type, and I remember it as follows: "Mercy for soldier murderer. Sergeant Maxime's death sentence commuted." Beneath this I read, substantially in these words: "Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, July 9. The War Department today ordered the sentence of Sergeant Wilfred Maxime, previously condemned to death by court-martial, to be commuted to life imprisonment. Maxime, who was convicted of a strange and brutal crime, the killing of a civilian laborer and the drinking of his blood, had been hanged in full view of his former comrades some weeks ago. Pronounced dead and cut down, he revived. When ordered to mount the scaffold and be hanged a second time, he protested that, being once certified deceased, the full penalty of his crime was paid, and he should be set free. He was held prisoner while the higher authority at Washington was consulted and handed down the commutation of sentence. A special guard will take Maxime to Fort Leavenworth for confinement." Just below this final short paragraph came the juncture of the two ends of the line that formed the ink circle, and the pen had apparently wavered over them. No, not exactly. On closer examination, I was sure that a word had been written beneath the item, and upon the line of the circle, a scrawled, crabbed word: "Fools." I twitched nervously, and my hands involuntarily clenched. The crackling sound of the old paper as it squashed in my grip made me start violently. I frowned in uneasy mystification. Brief as the news article was, and almost deadly dull in its patent journalistic phraseology, it reeked with unvoiced dread. What did it mean, it and the pamphlet which told a tale so ghastly parallel? 2 murderers had lived, 2 veritable vultures in man's guise, one exposed in 1847, the other 32 years later in 1879. Each was an army man. Each had the special ability and personality to win himself a sergeant's stripes. Each killed his fellow man in secret for the gratification of a horrible hunger. Each was condemned to death, and each proved almost impossible to kill. Each man's story had been published, and some collector of strange and revolting data had found both accounts, hiding them together under the floor of this old cabin. Yes, and each published story had come under the hand of a commentator who, through scorn or unbelief or macabre humor, had stamped each with the word "fools." I pored over the inked circle and the written word upon the newspaper. They too were faded, but not as much as the scrawl in the pamphlet, and the handwriting was strikingly similar. My judgment was that they were the work of the same penman, and that each was jotted down at the approximate time of the publication date of the account thus distinguished. I laid the half-crumpled fragment of newspaper on the floor beside the pamphlet. The remaining sheet stared up from my knee, a simple handbill, once folded small and now falling apart along its smoothed-out creases. It bore bold-faced type: $100, reward $100, for the capture of Wilfred Maxime, escaped murderer, July 14, 1879. A description followed, which I do not remember clearly, except for one phrase. Age, about 36. So Sergeant Maxime and Sergeant Stanless, at the times of their respective captures, had been alike in age as well as profession, rank, and depraved appetite. I shook myself, as if to dislodge panicky thoughts that crept upon the fringes of my consciousness. A corner of the reward notice I saw drooped heavily. Something was pasted to its back. I turned it over. A photograph looked up, a faded and discoloured likeness of a uniformed man's head and shoulders. Under it was written, Bill Maxime, January 7, 1872. I knew that crabbed handwriting at once. I knew, too, the face, but that was unbelievable, unspeakable. The old soldier's cheeks and jaws were thickly bearded. I could barely see a loose, greedy-looking mouth in the midst of that bushy hair, but the eyes were wide and vacant under their joined brows, the nose jutted straight and chisel-sharp. I started to voice an exclamation, but my lips were gone dry and numb. I stooped slowly for the discarded pamphlet. My hands trembled as they held the two portraits toward the flickering light, the photograph and the woodcut. I was sure then, and gasped inarticulately with the fearful knowledge. Ivan Stanless, shot almost to pieces, had not rested in his disgraced, unmarked grave. He had struggled up from under that burden of earth, had walked again. He had joined the army under a new name, had risen in rank, and was caught as before in the act of feeding loathsomely. Better for him and the world had his first court-martial done as he had pleaded. What were the words? I fumbled through the pages to the back of the pamphlet. Again I read, Burn me to ashes, I greatly wish it. Only thus can my soul be redeemed. A certainty that was more terrifying than blackest mystery drew in upon me like a strangling net. With all my strength I hurled pamphlet, newspaper, and handbill into the fire. The flames crackled greedily over the old sheets, threw up bright tongues. Yet I trembled with a chill that was not of the outer blizzard, and a voice soft as a sigh and fierce as a snarl spoke from the door. Fool! The door was open. A figure in a long, dark, formless garment like a cloak or blanket was standing there, shaking wreaths of snow from its head and shoulder. As I gaped, silent and helpless as a charmed bird before a snake, it glided forward to the fire. The enveloping robe sagged open, then slid gently downward from the upper part of the figure. I saw a round face, pale as bleached bone. Coarse, bushy hair grew low and rank upon a narrow forehead. Wide, expressionless eyes fixed mine, gleaming above the thin nose that seemed to point the way for them with its tip. A shallow chin relaxed, a loose, lipless mouth fell open. Two pointed upper teeth grinned at me. I tried to say something, to threaten or beg, but I could not. I only shrank back, and he stole forward into the stronger light. A hand extended toward me. I saw curved talons, thick hair matted upon wrist and back and palm. Then came a cry, powerful and ringing as a bugle, a torrent of strange, challenging words. Another figure was bursting through the door and toward us. The first comer turned hurriedly from me. For a moment I saw his pale, chisel-beaked face in profile, heard the cloak rustle like dried skin. Then the other was upon him in a rush. Fierce eyes above a bristling beard, an assailing odour of garlic, drove into my mind that this was the mumbler I had met at the forest's edge. His upflung hand flourished a staff, a heavy, straight rod with a piece lashed upon it to form a cross. It did not strike, but the sergeant squeaked fearfully, like a bat, and cowered swaying before it. A foot tripped him, and, as he fell sprawling, the same foot gave him a spurning shove that slid him among the coals of the fire. White flame sprang up all around and over him, as though he had exploded. I shuddered, and the next moment all was black silence to me. I woke laggingly to the touch of ministering hands, and found myself lying limply on the floor. Above me stooped the bearded face, anxious and kindly now. "It is all over," came the grave, accented voice, with a note of triumph in it. "Long have I hunted and hoped,
and today, when you entered his domain, I knew you would serve for bait. I made preparations and followed."
He drew something from his pocket.
"A stake through his heart and holy water would have been better, but the cross of white thorn and the fire and this herb,"
he threw a handful of garlic into the fireplace,
"will serve. He, Stanless or Maxime, or whoever he is, will walk and raven no more."
Weakly, I rose. Something made a feeble scuttling noise on the hearth, and I looked. The dying fire, now rank with the garlic vapours, was full of dark, fat-looking ashes that never came from wood. Out of these was scrambling some small creeper, a rat or lizard perhaps. Before I got a fair glimpse of it, my companion thrust it back with his staff. It did not appear again.
"Perhaps this was his cursed soul," commented my rescuer. "Do not be afraid. I know that all will be well. Before the Russian Revolution, I was a priest in Moscow, and studied these things. By dawn, his last shred of foul flesh, his last splinter of undead bone will be consumed in the cleansing heat."
Stooping, he began to gather floorboards. "You're a priest?" I repeated stupidly. "I was beginning to understand before you came. His story said that he wished to be burned."
"I knew of those writings, but I did not disturb them lest he be warned and guard against me. The ancient legends are not legends. They are truth denied by fear. In his first existence he was Volkerdluck, werewolf. Facing death, he must have had a desperate hope of salvation, and he made that request. He knew that if he were killed painlessly and his body left whole, he would still live as Upir, what you call vampire."
He threw his armful of wood upon the fire, and it began to crackle with bright, merry warmth.
"My son," said the priest, "have the fear of God before your eyes."
No Eyewitnesses by Henry S. Whitehead. There were bloodstains on Everard Simon's shoes. Simon's father had given up his country house in Rye when his wife died, and moved into an apartment in Flatbush, among the rising apartment houses which were steadily replacing the original rural atmosphere of that residential section of swelling Brooklyn. Bloodstains and forest mold on his shoes. The younger Simon, he was 37, his father getting on towards 70, always spent his winters in the West Indies, returning in the spring, going back again in October. He was a popular writer of informative magazine articles. As soon as his various visits for weekends and odd days were concluded, he would move his trunks into the Flatbush apartment and spend a week or two, sometimes longer, with his father. There was a room for him in the apartment, and this he would occupy until it was time for him to leave for his summer camp in the Adirondacks. Early in September, he would repeat the process, always ending his autumn stay in the United States with his father, until it was time to sail back to St. Thomas or Martinique, or wherever he imagined he could write best for that particular winter. There was only one drawback in this arrangement. This was the long ride in the subway, necessitated by his dropping into his New York club every day. The club was his real American headquarters. There he received his mail. There he usually lunched and often dined as well. It was at the club that he received his visitors and his telephone calls. The club was on 44th Street, and to get there from the apartment, he walked to the Church Avenue subway station, changed at DeKalb Avenue, and then took a Times Square express train over the Manhattan Bridge. The time consumed between the door of the apartment and the door of the club was exactly 3/4 of an hour, barring delays. For the older man, the arrangement was ideal. He could be in his office, he boasted, in 20 minutes. To avoid the annoyances of rush hours in the subway, Mr. Simon Sr. commonly left home quite early in the morning, about 7 o'clock. He was a methodical person, always leaving before 7 in the morning, and getting his breakfast in a downtown restaurant near the office. Everard Simon rarely left the apartment until after 9, thus avoiding the morning rush hour at its other end. During the 5 or 6 weeks every year that they lived together, the two men really saw little of each other, although strong bonds of understanding, affection, and respect bound them together. Sometimes the older man would awaken his son early in the morning for a brief conversation. Occasionally, the two would have a meal together, evenings or on Sundays. Now and then, an evening would be spent in each other's company. They had little to converse about. During the day, they would sometimes call each other up and speak together briefly on the telephone from club to office or office to club. On the day when Everard Simon sailed south, his father and he always took a farewell luncheon together, somewhere downtown. On the day of his return, 7 months later, his father always made it a point to meet him at the dock. These arrangements had prevailed for 11 years. He must get that blood wiped off. Blood? How? During that period, the neighborhood of the apartment had changed out of all recognition. Open lots, community tennis courts, and many of the older one-family houses had disappeared, to be replaced by the ubiquitous apartment houses. In 1928, the neighborhood, which had been almost rural when the older Simon had taken up his abode 20 minutes from his Wall Street office, was solidly built up, except for an occasional and now incongruous frame house standing lonely and dwarfed in its own grounds among the towering apartment houses, like a lost child in a preoccupied crowd of adults, whose business caused them to look over the child's head. One evening, not long before the end of his autumn sojourn in Flatbush, Everard Simon, having dined alone in his club, started for the Times Square subway station about 9:15. Doubled together lengthwise and pressing the pocket of his coat out of shape was a magazine out that day, which contained one of his articles. He stepped on board a waiting Sea Beach Express train in the rearmost car, sat down and opened the magazine, looking down the table of contents to find his article. The train started after the ringing of the warning bell and the automatic closing of the side doors, while he was putting on his reading spectacles. He began on the article. He was dimly conscious of the slight bustle of incoming passengers at Broadway and Canal Street, and again when the train ran out on the Manhattan Bridge because of the change in the light, but his closing of the magazine with a page corner turned down, and the replacing of the spectacles in his inside pocket when the train drew into DeKalb Avenue were almost entirely mechanical. He could make that change almost without thought. He had to cross the platform here at DeKalb Avenue, get into a Brighton Beach local train. The Brighton Beach Expresses ran only in rush hours, and he almost never traveled during those periods. He got into his train, found a seat, and resumed his reading. He paid no attention to the stations, Atlantic and 7th Avenues. The next stop after that, Prospect Park, would give him one of his mechanical signals, like coming out on the bridge. The train emerged from its tunnel at Prospect Park, only to re-enter it again at Parkside Avenue, the next following station. After that came Church Avenue, where he got out every evening. As the train drew into that station, he repeated the mechanics of turning down a page in the magazine, replacing his spectacles in their case, and putting the case in his inside pocket. His mind entirely on the article, he got up, left the train, walked back toward the Caton Avenue exit, started to mount the stairs. A few moments later he was walking, his mind still entirely occupied with his article, in the long familiar direction of his father's apartment. The first matter which reminded him of his surroundings was the contrast in his breathing after the somewhat stuffy air of the subway train. Consciously, he drew in a deep breath of the fresh, sweet outdoor air. There was a spicy odor of wet leaves about it somehow. It seemed, as he noticed his environment with the edge of his mind, darker than usual. The crossing of Church and Caton Avenues was a brightly lighted corner. Possibly something was temporarily wrong with the lighting system. He looked up. Great trees nodded above his head. He could see the stars twinkling above their lofty tops. The sickle edge of a moon cut sharply against black branches, moving gently in a fresh wind from the sea. He walked on several steps before he paused, slackened his gait, then stopped dead, his mind responding in a note of quiet wonderment. Great trees stood all about him. From some distance ahead, a joyous song in a manly bass, slightly muffled by the wood of the thick trees, came to his ears. It was a song new to him. He found himself listening to it eagerly. The song was entirely strange to him, the words unfamiliar. He listened intently. The singer came nearer. He caught various words, English words. He distinguished merry and heart and repine. It seemed entirely natural to be here. And yet, as he glanced down at his brown clothes, his highly polished shoes, felt the magazine bulging his pocket, the edge of his mind caught a note of incongruity. He remembered with a smile that strange drawing of Aubrey Beardsley's, of a lady playing an upright cottage pianoforte in the midst of a field of daisies. He stood, he perceived, in a kind of rough path worn by long usage. The ground was damp underfoot. Already his polished shoes were soiled with mould. The singer came nearer and nearer. Obviously, as the fresh voice indicated, it was a young man. Just as the voice presaged that before many seconds the singer must come out of the screening array of tree boles, Everard Simon was startled by a crashing quite nearby at his right. The singer paused in the middle of a note, and for an instant there was a primeval silence undisturbed by the rustle of a single leaf. Then a huge timber wolf burst through the underbrush to the right, paused, crouched, and sprang in a direction diagonal to that in which Everard Simon was facing, toward the singer. Startled into a frigid immobility, Simon stood as though petrified. He heard an exclamation in the singer's voice, a quick heh, then the sound of a struggle. The great wolf, apparently, had failed to knock down his quarry. Then, without warning, the two figures, man and wolf, came into plain sight. The singer, for so Simon thought of him, a tall, robust fellow, in fringed deerskin, slashing desperately with a hunting knife. The beast crouching now, snapping with a tearing motion of a great, punishing jaw. Short-breathed hes came from the man, as he parried dexterously the lashing snaps of the wicked jaws. The two, revolving about each other, came very close. Everard Simon watched the struggle, fascinated, motionless. Suddenly, the animal shifted its tactics. It backed away stealthily, preparing for another spring. The young woodsman abruptly dropped his knife, reached for the great pistol which depended from his belt in a rough leather holster. There was a blinding flash, and the wolf slithered down, its legs giving under it. A great cloud of acrid smoke drifted about Everard Simon, cutting off his vision, choking smoke which made him cough. But through it, he saw the look of horrified wonderment on the face of the young woodsman, saw the pistol drop on the damp ground as the knife had dropped, followed with his eyes through the dimming medium of the hanging smoke, the fascinated, round-eyed stare of the man who had fired the pistol. There, a few feet away from him, he saw an eldritch change passing over the beast, shivering now in its death struggle. He saw the hair of the great paws dissolve, the jaws shorten and shrink, the lithe body buckle and heave strangely. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he saw the figure in deerskin standing mutely over the body of a man, lying prone across tree roots, a pool of blood spreading from the concealed face, mingling with the damp earth under the tree roots. Then the strange spell of quiescence which had held him in its weird thrall was dissolved, and, moved by a nameless terror, he ran, wildly, straight down the narrow path between the trees. It seemed to him that he had been running only a short distance when something, the moon above the trees perhaps, began to increase in size, to give a more brilliant light. He slackened his pace. The ground now felt firm underfoot, no longer damp, slippery. Other lights joined that of the moon. Things became brighter all about him, and as this brilliance increased, the great trees all about him turned dim and pale. The ground was now quite hard underfoot. He looked up. A brick wall faced him. It was pierced with windows. He looked down. He stood on pavement. Overhead, a street light swung lightly in the late September breeze. A faint smell of wet leaves was in the air, mingled now with the fresh wind from the sea. The magazine was clutched tightly in his left hand. He had, it appeared, drawn it from his pocket. He looked at it curiously, put it back into the pocket. He stepped along over familiar pavement, past well-known facades. The entrance to his father's apartment loomed before him. Mechanically, he thrust his left hand into his trousers pocket. He took out his key, opened the door, traversed the familiar hallway with its rugs and marble walls and bracket side-wall light clusters. He mounted the stairs, one flight, turned the corner, reached the door of the apartment, let himself in with his key. It was 9:30, and his father had already retired. They talked through the old man's bedroom door monosyllabically. The conversation ended with the request from his father that he close the bedroom door. He did so, after wishing the old man good night. He sat down in an armchair in the living room, passed a hand over his forehead, amused. He sat for 15 minutes. Then he reached into his pocket for a cigarette. They were all gone. Then he remembered that he had meant to buy a fresh supply on his way to the apartment. He had meant to get the cigarettes from the drugstore between the Church Avenue subway station and the apartment. He looked about the room for one. His father's supply, too, seemed depleted. He rose, walked into the entry, put on his hat, stepped out again into the hallway, descended the one flight, went out into the street. He walked into an unwanted atmosphere of excitement. People were conversing as they passed, in excited tones. About the drugstore entrance a crowd was gathered. Slightly puzzled, he walked toward it, paused, blocked on the outer edge. "What's happened?" he inquired of a young man whom he found standing just beside him, a little to the fore. "It's a shooting of some kind," the young man explained. "I only just got here myself. The fellow that got bumped off is inside the drugstore. What's left of him. Some gang war stuff, I guess." He walked away, skirting the rounded edge of the clustering crowd of curiosity-mongers, proceeded down the street, procured the cigarettes elsewhere. He passed the now enlarged crowd on the other side of the street on his way back, returned to the apartment, where he sat, smoking and thinking, until 11, when he retired. Curious, a man shot, just at the time, or about the time, he had let that imagination of his get the better of him. Those trees. His father awakened him about 5 minutes before 7. The old man held a newspaper in his hand. He pointed to a scarehead on the front page. "This must have happened about the time you came in," remarked Mr. Simon. "Yes, the crowd was around the drugstore when I went out to get some cigarettes," replied Everard Simon, stretching and yawning. When his father was gone, and he had finished with his bath, he sat down in a bathrobe to glance over the newspaper account. A phrase arrested him. The body was identified as that of Jerry the Wolf, a notorious gangster with a long prison record. Then, lower down when he had resumed his reading, a large caliber bullet which, entering the lower jaw, penetrated the base of the brain. No eyewitnesses. Everard Simon sat for a long time after he had finished the account, the newspaper on the floor by his chair. No eyewitnesses. He must really keep that imagination of his within bounds, within his control. Slowly and reflectively, this good resolution uppermost, he went back to the bathroom and prepared for his morning shave. Putting on his shoes in his room, he observed something amiss. He picked up a shoe, examined it carefully. The soles of the shoes were caked with black mold, precisely like the mold from the wood paths about his Adirondack camp. Little withered leaves and dried pine needles clung to the mold, and on the side of the right shoe were brownish stains, exactly like freshly dried bloodstains. He shuddered as he carried the shoes into the bathroom, wiped them clean with a damp towel, then rinsed out the towel. He put them on, and shortly afterward, before he entered the subway to go over to the club for the day, he had them polished. The bootblack spoke of the killing on that corner the night before. The bootblack noticed nothing amiss with the shoes, and when he had finished, there was no trace of any stains. Simon did not change at DeKalb Avenue that morning. An idea had occurred to him between Church Avenue and DeKalb, and he stayed on the Brighton local, secured a seat after the emptying process which took place at DeKalb, and went on through the East River Tunnel. He sent in his name to Forrest, a college acquaintance, now in the district attorney's office, and Forrest received him after a brief delay. "I wanted to ask a detail about this gangster who was killed in Flatbush last night," said Simon. "I suppose you have his record, haven't you?" "Yes, we know pretty well all about him. What particular thing did you want to know?" "About his name," replied Simon. "Why was he called Jerry the Wolf? That is, why the wolf particularly?" "That's a very queer thing, Simon. Such a name is not really uncommon. There was that fellow Goddard, you remember. They called him the Wolf of Wall Street. There was the fiction criminal known as the Lone Wolf. There have been plenty of wolves among criminal monikers. But this fellow, Jerry Garafsky, was a Hungarian, really. He was called the Wolf, queerly enough, because there was those in his gang who believed he was one of those birds who could change himself into a wolf. It's a queer combination, isn't it, for a New York gangster?" "Yes," said Everard Simon. "It is very queer when you come to think of it. I'm much obliged to you for telling me. I was curious about it somehow." "That isn't the only queer aspect of this case, however," resumed Forrest, a light frown suddenly showing on his keen face. "In fact, that wolf thing isn't a part of the case. Doesn't concern us, of course, here in the district attorney's office. That's nothing but blah. Gangsters are as superstitious as sailors. More so, in fact. No, the real mystery in this affair is the bullet, Simon. Want to see it?" "Why, yes, of course, if you like, Forrest. What's wrong with the bullet?" Forrest stepped out of the room, returned at once, laid a large round ball on his desk. Both men bent over it, curiously. "Notice that diameter, Simon," said Forrest. "It's a hand-moulded round ball. Belongs in a collection of curios, not in any gangster's gat. Why, man, it's like the slugs they used to hunt the bison before the old Sharp's rifle was invented. It's the kind of a ball Fenimore Cooper's people used. Deer slayer. It would take a young cannon to throw that thing. Smashed in the whole front of Jerry's ugly mug. The inside works of his head were spilled all over the sidewalk. It's what the newspapers always call a clue. Who do you suppose resurrected the horse pistol, or the ship's blunderbuss, to do that job on Jerry? Clever in a way. Hooked it out of some dime museum, perhaps. There are still a few of those old pitches still operating, you know, at the old stand, along East 14th Street. A flintlock single-shot horse pistol, I'd imagine," said Everard Simon, laying the ounce-lead ball back on the mahogany desk. He knew something of weapons, new and old. As a writer of information articles, that was part of his permanent equipment. "Very likely. mused the assistant district attorney. "Glad you came in, old man." And Everard Simon went on uptown to his club. The Werewolf Snarls by Manly Wade Wellman. "I want you to meet Mr. Crow," prattled Lola Werther to me. "He claims to be a werewolf." And she turned, fluttery hands, fluttery white shoulders, fluttery blonde curls, fluttery skirts of green silk, to lose herself in the crowd of noisy guests at the bar. Mr. Crow and I took 2 or 3 steps together, as though we both sought quiet. "Sit down," I suggested, and we dropped upon a divan in the half-gloom behind Lola Werther's big, grand piano. Then we looked at each other. He was a huge, high-shouldered creature, in rather seedy dress clothes, with coarse black hair grown low on his forehead and around his flat-lying, pointed ears. His long anvil of a chin lay snugly between the wings of his collar, his long poniard of a nose lay upon his chin, and his mouth caught between was as tight and lipless as a slit in leather. The pallor of his face accentuated the wet, licorice black of his eyes. He made me feel my own physical frailty as a little, rheumatic old man half his volume. "Well," he invited huskily, "do I look it?" "You mean like a werewolf?" I suggested, and waited, smiling, for the witty retort. But he shook his head. "It happens to be quite true," he assured me, with the absolute solemnity of the very drunken or the very insane. I jumped at that, although I was used to meeting bizarre figures in the Werther parlor. Not knowing what to say, I kept my own nervous mouth shut. After a musing moment, Crow went on. "I came here tonight looking for help in my desperate problem. Werther and his wife are supposed to be experts in occultism." "Mr. Crow," I could not help saying, "the Werthers are unmitigated fakes." "I was thinking that," he nodded glumly. "Apparently their only reason for letting me come was to make sport for their friends." A pause, awkward for me at least. "Well then, shall I tell you?" "Please do," I urged, feeling strangely foolish. Crow hunched his shoulders, sank his head, and let his clasped hands slide down between his knees until the thick knuckles almost rested on the floor. There was something animal-like in the attitude. His body and limbs seemed measured and joined according to an abnormal pattern. His licorice eyes sought mine, and at the moment they did not look exactly human either. Too much gloomy iris for one thing, and too little rim of white for another. In their depths lurked a green light, feeble but hard. "It began," said Crow, "when I experimented with the witch ointments." "Witch ointments?" "Yes, supposed to be rubbed on for changes into animal forms, made and used by magicians according to satanic formulas. They sound fantastic, I know, but I was a medical student, working on a paper about pre-Renaissance medicine. There were several recipes." "Recipes?" I repeated. "Not really." "Yes, a dozen at least. The 1896 Bulletin of Johns Hopkins Hospital printed one, in an article by Dr. Robert Fletcher. Several other modern scientists have offered others, wholly or in part, and let me tell you that there's more sound pharmacy in them than you'd think." I thought, indeed hoped, that he was merely spoofing, but there was no bantering smile upon his thin lips, and his eyes looked drawn and haggard about the corners.
Belladonna, for instance, he amplified. It's a common ingredient. Makes you see visions, as you probably know. And monkshood, full of deadly aconitine. Henbane, that Shakespeare called the insane root, and hemlock. These and other things, made into a salve with the fat of an unbaptized child. I say, I broke in again, not very politely. You don't ask me to believe that you... But I did. Again that melancholy nod of assurance. There was a baby's body fetched to the dissecting room at school. He paused, and his eyes narrowed, as though to gaze down a fearsome groove into the past. Well, I mixed the stuff up, for a lark. His mouth slashed open in a rueful grin, revealing oversized, uneven teeth. You rubbed it on? I prompted. Once more he nodded, and I pursued. What happened? Nothing. Craw sat up straight again and spoke more clearly. I don't know what I expected to happen, or if in truth I expected anything, but I do remember feeling like a fool, and an unclean fool to boot. I started to clean the grease off, but it had absorbed into me somehow, like a vanishing cosmetic. He shuddered slightly, briefly. As I say, nothing happened all that day, or that night, or the next day, but the next night. And his voice dropped suddenly to a breathy mutter, was the night of the full moon. On the instant, I remembered a host of stories with which my childhood nurse had regaled me, stories about the full moon and its effect on the human soul and fate. Few of them had been pleasant. Craw was plunging ahead. Moonlight meant romance to me then, and nothing more. Collegian-like, I went on a riverside walk with a girl, a liberal arts sophomore. There was a sort of sandy jut out into the water, and we loitered there. Something I said made her laugh, with her face turned up to me in the moonlight. Then she stopped laughing, and her mouth twisted like a snake when you step on it. Whatever for? I almost gasped. Her eyes, on my face, were frightened. Craw leaned suddenly toward me. I caught, or fancied I caught, a whiff of musky odor, as from an animal cage. In spite of myself, I slid back and away from him on the cushions. I just remembered that there was a full moon tonight. Again, Craw's tense voice. She tried to scream, and, frightened myself, I grasped her by the shoulder to calm her. When I touched her flesh, a new mood suddenly took possession of me. Of its own will, my hand switched to her throat, shaking her. I snarled at her to be silent, and she sagged down in a faint. My thoughts and senses churned all up, as if in a new feeling of exultation at conquest. Then he spread his great spatulate fingers. In the morning they found her gnawed body. In the afternoon, while I was still telling myself that it was a dream, the police came to my dormitory. They found blood on my clothing and under my nails. You were that, Craw, I exclaimed. His smile was bitter and tight-lipped this time. Oh, so you read the papers. Undergraduate beast-man, the headlines called me, and medico-monster. What I told the police, the solemn truth, was too much for them to believe. They called in alienists, so I was sent to the asylum, not to the electric chair. Look here, I ventured, in a voice that threatened to close up in my throat with every word. I think you'd better talk about something else. You shouldn't have let yourself talk about this business in the first place. But he shook his head so emphatically that the coarse locks stirred at his narrow temples. I'm not crazy, old chap. You see, just 2 weeks ago, I was officially certified normal. He sniffed. How could they know the frenzy, the throttling rage and the bloodthirst that closed over me like water in my locked room every month on the night when the moon was full? His clenched hands lifted. I saw his nails pointed and thick and opaque like pieces of mussel shell. I used to howl and shriek so that the attendants came to pacify me. They got bitten for their pains, so there were barred cells and straitjackets. It was 2 years before a cunning sneaked in with the moon madness, a cunning that whispered I must suffer in silence if ever I wanted to go free. And you were silent? I was. At length the doctors had me up for another examination. They hammered at my knees for reflexes, asked a bunch of clever questions, and finally discharged me as cured. Once again, a pause. But I wasn't cured, of course. Surely, I mouthed in the most stupid fashion imaginable. Surely you wanted to be cured. Of course. Craw snapped his big teeth together after the 2 words, as though they needed emphasis. So I turned to the Werthers, as I said at the beginning. I'd heard somewhere that they knew devil and all about occultism and the night side of the soul. A week ago, I hunted James Werther out at his club and told him the whole cursed business. Told him what you've just told me? Exactly, and he heard me out, then said nothing for a full 5 minutes. Finally he smiled and said, I'll help you. On the night of the full moon I'll be entertaining. Come to my place then, and we'll make everything all right. He leaned against the cushions, as if his story was done. I wriggled nervously, wondering whether he was very clever, even cleverer than most of the bizarre Werther guests, or whether he was dangerous. I weighed the chances of getting up and walking away without seeming too furtive. "Oh, there you are, Mr. Craw," squealed Lola Werther behind our shoulders. "Some new people have come, girls, and they're dying to meet—" She swooped down upon him and bore him away toward 3 young women with vapid, painted smiles. It was my chance to leave, and I took it. I crossed the room to the chairs where the hats and coats were piled. Glancing back, I saw Craw yet again from behind. His shoulders seemed strangely narrow and humped in a fashion somehow hyena-like. His hair, perhaps it was not carefully combed at the back of his low skull, was shaggy. At first I had thought his ears flat, but I saw now that they inclined forward, as though involuntarily pricked up. He claims to be a werewolf. Lola Werther was finishing her introduction, and a tinkle of laughter ascended all around. I got my things, and left without being noticed. That was last night. Before me lies the morning paper, with an arresting headline. 4 torn corpses found in parlor. Police baffled over murder of James Werther and guests. Seek Beastman. I have not yet forced myself to read the rest.
The Fisherman Special by H.L. Thomson. And so, said my lean-jawed share of a seat on the Fisherman Special from New York to Montauk, there's more, much more to it than backwoods superstition. Man! He leaned over and pounded my knee with his hard, brown fist. I tell you, I know. I laughed. I had to. This big, hulking chap who had seated himself beside me when the special pulled out of Pennsylvania Station Had me jittery with his talk about the supernatural powers of man. He'd been at it for over an hour. I shivered. Patchogue and the Hamptons were behind us, and the wind blasting through the opened windows of the coach was cold. Besides, this talk of werewolves and other things which I had relegated to my adolescence caused goosebumps to shoot along my spine. "I'll tell you a queer story," commenced my seatmate. "Back in my country." I looked at him quickly. He didn't look like a foreigner to me. He grinned. "I've been here a long time," he said. "You certainly have no trace of an accent," I said. "English?" "No, Swedish. A man who has to travel a lot, first in one country, then another, soon loses his accent." "I suppose so," I told him. "I come from a small town in the extreme northern part of Sweden," he said. "Many queer and unnatural things happen there. There are werewolves, men who at will turn themselves into wolf-men and roam the countryside, bringing death and misery and stark, wild-eyed horror." He shuddered and continued. "It's nothing new. It's old. It's been going on since the beginning of time. It's written of in musty books and talked of furtively as darkness falls. Every year at the beginning of the Christmas season, that's when it happens. It's when the snow burns blue with the coming dark and squeals beneath your boots. The conversion of men into beasts. It has always been so. They descend upon the helpless inhabitants of ancient villages and destroy them. A lot of good yarns have been spun around that sort of thing," I said. "Interesting reading. Good stuff." His steady eyes stared straight ahead, and he didn't answer me for a minute or two. Then he jerked his head impatiently. "Up there, just before night, when the snow is so white it turns blue and squeals beneath your boots like a living thing." His voice died away, as if he were living 1,000,000 miles away. He continued in the same sing-song voice. "There in the town where I grew up lived 2 brothers. Both were tall, straight, and strong. They loved the same girl, but she preferred the older brother. He was good and steady, and the young one," his voice became harsh, "was a fool. Selma, that was her name. She married the older brother early one spring, and the 3 of them lived together in their old, whitewashed house near the end of the village. But the happiness of his brother and Selma kept misery gnawing at the innards of the younger brother. He grew morose and ugly. He spent his nights in the town tavern. He'd stay there until all the lights in the little house were out. Then he'd go in and throw himself into bed and fall into drunken slumber." I commenced to fidget. I wished soundly that I was at Montauk or back in New York. This fellow got on my nerves dreamily. I made up my mind to check him fast during the rush from the train. I must have missed part of the conversation. I caught myself up short when I heard him say, "werewolves." "What's that?" I asked. I said that the stranger he met in the tavern one winter's night told him he could change himself into a wolf-man and join the other werewolves on the eve of Christmas. I shoved my tongue in my cheek. "He told the younger brother that?" He nodded. "Yes, he told him how it might be done." "Did he do it?" I asked. My somber friend nodded again. "How?" I asked, smirking. "I might try it myself if the fish aren't biting out here." He gripped my arm. "My friend, if you value your sanity, if you would not rove the world with the screams of the innocents in your ears, if you value your hope of immortality, never try it. The poor misguided younger brother was a victim of jealousy, fancied wrongs." "We all have 'em," I said. "How's it done?" "It is done," he said, glancing over his shoulder quickly, "by muttering certain words." "What words?" I interrupted. "Those I shall not tell you. By muttering certain words and drinking a cup of ale to a man-wolf. If he accepts, it renders the man natural, worthy of acceptance of the werewolf state." "I'll have to remember that," I said. I've had many a cup of ale with strangers. All of which reminds me, how about a drink? I reached for my gunny sack. I never drink. Well, here's to you, I said, peeling off the top of my jug. Whether the roadbed was rougher than usual, or whether the train went around a curve, I don't know. But suddenly my friend fell, almost in my lap, and my bottle of rye went out of the window. Old Gloomface smiled. I'm sorry, he said. Possibly I can make it up to you by finishing my story. I grinned with only one side of my mouth. Forget it. Shoot. Did the younger brother turn himself into a werewolf? He did. On the eve of Christmas, when they strung the tree with popcorn and red cranberries, his hatred and jealousy boiled over. He tore out of the house and went to the tavern. There he filled himself with spirits and brooded over his loss of Selma. After a time, he got to his feet and went into the forest. There, in his drunkenness, he pronounced the words and assumed the wolf form. What did he do? Go back and gnaw up his brother? He came back. But first he travelled to the spot which had been made known to him by the stranger in the tavern. It was many miles north, beneath the wall of a ruined castle of some feudal lord. There he joined hundreds of others who, in natural form, were weak, frustrated men such as he. Then the pack set out en masse. Strong doors were paper before them, white, unprotected throats their aim. Shrill, gurgling screams of their victims on the still cold air whetted their appetites. What about the younger brother, our hero? I asked. I haven't forgotten the younger brother. He ran with great leaping bounds straight to his home. His red tongue lolled from his gaping mouth. His eyes were green in their madness. I frowned. This fellow certainly threw himself into his story like a professional. He had goose flesh on my neck. This werewolf, this beast, attacked his brother and the lovely Selma as they lay in their bed. He felt his own brother's hot blood in his dry throat. He shook him as a terrier does a rag. The lovely Selma screamed and tore at him with her little hands. No one came to help them? I asked. You forget. The town was in an uproar. The whole pack attacked. And Selma? I said. Yes, Selma. Selma grabbed the other brother's hunting knife from his belt on the back of the chair and stabbed at the werewolf, screaming curses. My God, how ghastly. Did she kill him? He shook his head. No, she didn't kill him. She only tore off his right ear with the sharp knife, and in the manner of all things who attack in the night, his own pain defeated him. He ran out of the house and from the village. He disappeared into the dark forest. His red blood stained the white snow for miles. They could have trailed him that way. He shook his head. No, he assumed the human form once he was in the forest and staunched the flow of blood. But the wound, I protested. How could he explain that to the townspeople, to Selma? He never went back. He ran away. The people of the town must have thought he too was a victim of the werewolves that bloody, gory night. The conductor pulled the door of the coach open. Montauk, Montauk, he called. All around us, men started whooping and grabbing up their equipment. I sat quietly for a minute. What a story, I finally managed to say. What a story to tell a man when he's out at the end of nowhere. I've got the creeps. He shrugged. It was merely to pass the time. Any sort of conversation to pass the time. Good luck. Good fishing. He got up to get his stuff. Same to you, I said, sticking out my hand. As my eyes met his, I started, and my hand dropped nervelessly to my side. He grinned crookedly, but that lopsided twitching of his face only accentuated the horror of the livid hole where his right ear should have been.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,